Mà ta các quẹt ta làm vì đó ta cái nó qua cái con này luôn cái nó chiếc là số ý nè. Ye ha hey 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 ga ho how hey hey ga ho hon da hey you manu wa no hon da hey you manu wa you que con ni long na chi hey hey ho ye ha hey 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 ga ho how hey ho ya he no mano wa to ho ya he yo mano wa yo be go ni lo ngon la di hey hey ho ye ha hey ga ho hey ga ho thon se ki ka no mo thon se ki ka no mo yo be go ni lo ngon la di hey ho ye ha hey ga ho hey ga ho we ho lo mai là chế quen đàn em nó này giống là cái can sẽ xếp at the way này you go away they are elangu they are elama coming they lo at hey ke no mui ye come hey ho ye lo come hey yo di
Are we rolling already? We're just going to cut live, huh? Oh, okay. Well, that sounds good. Well, in that case, Kulamotsi Hach, are you feeling well? You can answer Nulamotsi. Nulamotsi, very good. Well, if you're not feeling quite well, you can say Kumayai. I'm not feeling real well. Kushuai, Kishkwik, it's kind of hot today. Common greetings that you'll hear when you're visiting different people. And on Gumi, come right in. I'm giving a Delaware language lesson, so shake my hand. More of a command form. Delaware's arrived in Oklahoma in the 1860s, mid-1860s, after we signed an agreement with the Cherokee Nation to purchase land here. And we did that. We were living in the north side of Kansas. But when Kansas wanted to become a state, they spent several years trying to find a place for us. And the Cherokees agreed to let us buy land down here and move down here, where each Delaware was given a 160-acre allotment. However, that treaty was not actually passed by the tribe, and so in effect it was kind of a forced removal to come down here, but eventually they all did come down and move down here from Kansas. And those people who did make it, there were probably less than 800 of them. The Delaware people also are known by another name, which is Lenape, commonly known as the Lenni Lenape, which is kind of a redundant term. But that's the name that you hear most often back east, although we don't use that term. But the Lenni Lenape word actually means people. And so we think that it actually was used to refer to just saying common people. And most tribes, actually, that is what their term for themselves stands for. It's either human beings or just the common people. And kind of interesting that that analogy, how those tribes do have that in common, what they call themselves. The Delaware originally were on the East Coast. They occupied all of New Jersey, southern part of New York, the eastern part of Pennsylvania, and the northern part of Maryland and Delaware. The southern part of the tribe was called the Unamis, and that meant that the people that lived south of the Delaware River, which incidentally was named after Lord Delaware, who was the governor of Maryland in that area, and they gave that river his name, and that's the name that we have become accustomed to and are known by, the Delaware. But as I said earlier, we call ourselves Lenape. But the southern part of the tribe were called the Unamis, and that was the downriver people. The northern part of the tribe, which lived on the north side of the Delaware River, those people were called Munsee. And they are Delawares. There is a connection in our language, but there is dialectical differences in that language. And today, those people actually live in Canada. They have a couple of reserves up there, and most of the Munsees live up there. There are a few that moved down here with us, but most of those people did eventually move back, to their own people up north. It took us many years to move to this area. We moved halfway across the country. We signed the very first treaty with the United States government with an Indian tribe, and the United States was with the Delaware tribe. And incidentally, the second tribe was the Cherokee Nation, which we reside with today here in this area. And over those years, we signed 18 treaties, and of course, all of them were broken at some point along the line, until we ended up here where we are today. But the Delawares played an important role in 6 different states, commonly New Jersey and New York and those things, but Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And we have actually been welcomed back into all of those states, as if we were from there, but we actually weren't, but we played such a great role in their history, of those states. And so we do a lot of programs back there today. Even Sandy Hook, New Jersey, we do some programs up there. And then Indiana is another place. A lot of the place names are still the same from here all the way back to, the East Coast. The most common name you hear, Manhattan, that is a Delaware name. But we call it Minatin, and it means the place that is an island. And several common names in New York City, like Hoboken, which is Hoboken to us, means place of the smoke. Passaic, Monongahela, Susquehanna, although those things have been anglicized, those are Delaware words. Philadelphia used to be called Shakamak, and the beautiful place. And so those names are still there. The Tacony Bridge there, which means Cold River. So all of those names are still there, and even when we travel, we see those names there, and it's amazing. They are anglicized, but we recognize them for, I'm sure those people have no idea where those names came from, but we do when we go back there. And it is amazing that the names have stayed the same, although they have anglicized. And I always like to point out to some people, I said, there is a state in this country that is an actual Delaware word. And what state is that? And most commonly people will say Delaware, of course. Well, actually it's not, it's Wyoming. Wyoming was actually a city in Pennsylvania that became when they were looking for a name, the people who were naming the state thought about Wyoming and Pennsylvania. And to us it means a great open plain, great open space. And so that name became a state. And it's kind of interesting that it is a Delaware word, an Algonquin word. The Delaware language is considered part of the Algonquin language, and we share that with several other tribes. As we traveled back across the country, like I said, we spent a lot of time in several different states. We signed a lot of treaties, fought a lot of wars. In fact, one that I recall, interesting enough, my family name is Musikan, which is elk hair. And recently I was reading a book about Tecumseh. And the Delawares, for most part, supported Tecumseh, although they did not support his brother, the prophet. And in fact, Dave Edmonds, who is a professor at Indiana University, wrote a book about Tecumseh, and in that book he made mention of the elk hairs and the fact that they did not support the prophet. And when I met with him several years ago, I said, was happy to read your book, but I was shocked that I, saw my family name in there. And he said, well, there was actually a referral in there by somebody, and he did include that in the book. And he said, although I've never met any elk here, so I'm glad to meet you. I said, yeah, we're still here. The elk warriors are still alive and well. As we came back across the country, we played a part in a lot of the major battles that took place across this country. Perhaps the most telling one was the Battle of Falling Timbers, in which Mad Anthony Wayne, who was the general of the time, known for his exploits in the colonial times, was the general leading that. And that battle took place in the 1790s in Ohio. And it was a great defeat for the tribes that were there, especially the Miami, the Delaware, the Kaskaskias, Sac and Fox even participated in that. And that was probably the only time that all those tribes actually foresaw Tecumseh's dream, where they all actually fought together. But after the battle, prior to the Battle of Fallen Timbers, they actually inflicted on the United States government the worst loss they had ever encountered, as a standing army, and they were completely routed by the tribes. But most tribes are very notorious in their ways they do things, and when the battle was over, they figured their job was done. Most of those tribes left and went home, not realizing that there were still more battles to be fought. And so when they did fight at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Mad Anthony Wayne did win out that day. However, if he'd been facing all the tribes, the history of the country might have been completely different. But in 1795, the Delawares, the Miamis, the Shawnee, Kaskaskias, the Potawatomi, several other tribes participated in the battle or the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, and they signed away their rights to Ohio and moved on into Indiana, which the Miamis were already there, and in fact the Delawares were already there at the request of the Miamis. They said, come in and move in with us. And so in the northeastern part of Indiana, you have below Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was actually called Kikiongo in those days, and that was the Miami capital, if you where Little Turtle lived, who was the chief at the time. And we moved in south of there, and those two names that are most prevalent there in Indiana, the Muncie, Indiana, and Anderson, Indiana. And those were Delaware villages. And there actually are several more small towns in there that have actually kept the Delaware name for them. We lived along the White River there. From there, the Delawares moved into Missouri. We weren't there very long. The living conditions were very bad. And of course, this was prior to the United States buying the land from the Mexicans. Or not the Mexican, well, it was the Mexican government at that time, and before the Louisiana Purchase, actually. And so, although by St. Louis there were a lot of Mexican people who were living there at the time, and that's where we actually lived, around Cape Girardeau, but only for about 2 years. And if you've been there, there's no way you can live there or do any kind of crops or anything else, raise even cattle, because it's too hilly, and so we had a very tough time there. But finally, by the late 1820s, the Delawares moved into northern Kansas and actually occupied the whole north part of Kansas, and that actually, as the Turkey Strip here is in Oklahoma, the northern part of Kansas became the Delaware Strip. And the Delawares spent a lot of time hunting parties out in the western part, and they actually competed with the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee over those hunting rights out there, and actually fought against each other over the bison herds that were still there at that time. And so at that point is where the Delawares actually made a transition from being a woodland tribe to becoming almost a plains tribe. And a lot of things did take place there, although we never lost our language or even the old religions that we practiced. And incidentally, we refer to our creator as Kishe Lamukon. and that's our word for Creator. Now, when we speak to the Creator as in a prayer, we would say Kishe la Miyang, which is we're speaking to our Father, to our Creator. The Delawares always believed in a single God. Several times in our history, we were proselytized to from many different church organizations, and notably the Moravians spent a lot of time, and in fact the Muncie spent a lot of time with him up there. And they had a great time with the Baptists too. Also spent a lot of time with us, and especially in Kansas too. And in fact, my grandfather went to school. He was one of the first. Charles Elker was one of the first people to sign up as in the Baptist Mission in Kansas. So that's an interesting part of history we get to see every once in a while. But eventually, in the 1860s, we did move into Oklahoma, purchase this land from the Cherokees. From the Treaty of 1866, that treaty allowed us to purchase land within Cherokee Nation, and for an additional sum, we were able to pay into the National Fund, Cherokee National Fund, and to retain our sovereignty as a tribe. And so that's what we did.
What happened during the Civil War in that period, 1866?
During the Civil War, there was a great upheaval in the southwest part of this state, Oklahoma, because our western Delaware people, which was one clan of the Delaware tribe that split off in Missouri and went down into Texas with the Caddos and the Wichitas. The Cherokee, which took up the side of the South, were mistreating a lot of the Delawares and the Wichitas out there. And so that kind of incensed the rest of the tribe living up north part of Lawrence, Kansas, in that area. And so 80% of the men who were eligible to sign up for the Civil War signed up and fought for the Union. And so, in fact, I cannot remember who the general was. It might have been Kearney at that time who made a recommendation about the tribe, and he said that no other group of, or no other ethnic group or a tribal group had ever signed a greater number of their people than the Delawares, because they believed it was important for them to fight for the Union and to help their people down south. And so that's what they did.
Excuse me. It seems like Delaware has really interesting coexistence militarily with the United States government, unlike a lot of other tribes. And you've also found out recently this extends back to colonial times.
Oh, absolutely.
Would you take us through that process?
Okay. I suppose that just because of our closeness with the colonial people, the Europeans, when we had first contact, we did welcome them at first. In fact, we always welcomed them, but we had a completely different outlook on, how we lived our lives. We lived in a free, open country. Nobody truly owned anything. They had hunting areas, which they considered, family areas, but there was no ownership of the land, so it was very difficult for them to understand when people come to trade for, rights to the land, and we were thought they were asking for hunting rights instead of actually purchasing the land and then fencing it in where nobody else could come in. That was very difficult for the Delawares to understand. And of course the Manhats, that's the most famous one, Peter Minuet buying, Manhattan Island from the, and that was, the Manhats were really a band of the tribe, but they thought they were selling hunting rights. They didn't realize they were selling it. However, there is a point of history that I might point out, is that although we did allow them to sell that area for $24, worthless trinkets, the tribe actually did get even several years later when the Dutch came to us again and wanted to buy some more land just north of that area, out where Shea Stadium is today, in that area, the Queens, and in New York City today. And we actually did go out there and allow them to purchase that land. In fact, we took them out there and there was an expanse of about maybe 100 yards there, and then there was dense forest behind that. And so we stood there and said, yes, as far as you can walk, in half a day, you can have that land, as far as you can go back there, and we'll sell it to you for a certain amount, to which the Dutch agreed. And to which afterwards the Delawares walked off laughing to themselves, because the Dutch did not know that beyond those trees it was all swamp. So in a sense we got even with them for buying Manhattan Island so cheaply. Although they were able to salvage the land and still use it. But that's where Shea Stadium is today, is right in the middle of that land that we sold to them. But because of that proximity with the colonial people, we did act on their behalf, and they did come to us to act on their behalf with the other tribes, and we did do that for them, and spent a lot of time as scouts, for the next 200 years almost. But in colonial times, the Delawares were a very powerful tribe, very well respected. They were called the grandfather tribe, and we did act on the behalf of the government many times. Although we tried not to take sides, because actually many Delawares fought on both sides. During the French and Indian War, we fought, on the part of the French and sometimes with the English, and this depends on who was paying more and offering more at that time. But during the colonial war between the colonials and the English government, we tried not to take sides in that. Although we did favor the colonial people, and they were well knew that we were in their favor, but we did not want to fight at arms because there were too few of us, and it was not worth decimating the tribe over. We didn't think it was that important to have our own people killed for an argument between two governments that had nothing to do with us. And so we tried to stay out of that, although we did find out recently, man did send us that there were 2 regiments of Delaware warriors that actually fought in regimental gear, evidently, with the colonial government, fought with George Washington. And that was an interesting fact that even I wasn't aware of that. But that's part of the interesting part of our history, is that we hear things all the time, from many different sources. And most of the time those sources can be from the government, but most of the time those sources are from local histories, where people have referred to something that happened in that area from the tribe, and then that's been passed on to the local historical society, and then that historical society sends it on to our tribe. So we get those kinds of information all the time. One interesting story that I thought was very interesting a few years ago, when I attended the 200th anniversary of the Treaty of Greenville. The Treaty of Greenville, my great-great-grandfather, Chief Anderson, signed that treaty, and from that we gave up our rights, in Ohio, and moved on into Indiana. But while I was there was a man from the Historical Society there in Ohio who had made a small history. He was a store owner and had dealt with the Delawares many times. And he said the thing that he enjoyed about the Delawares was that they knew their weapons, and they would not take trade weapons. They wanted specific weapons and would not accept anything. And he said the reason was, he said, they had become so accustomed to using fine weapons, they knew what was good and what was bad. They knew what would work and what wouldn't work, and that they spent a lot of time training their young people how to use their weapons and how to take care of them and know good weapons from bad. And therefore the Delawares were very well known as being excellent shots, excellent hunters. And so whenever they were contacted by the government, that's why they were contacted, because they knew that the Delawares could handle it. And so that was an interesting part of history that I had never heard from, but the store owner said it was always very difficult to deal with the Delawares because they knew what they wanted, and he knew would not get off cheap, on some of those things. So very interesting. But after that point, the Delawares didn't fight in any major battles after that point, except Civil War. but they did fight in a lot of small skirmishes with other tribes, notably the Osage and the Pawnee, the Sioux, the Cheyenne.
Told an interesting story a little while ago about some of the Delaware who let the rest of the tribe escape while they were fighting the Osage.
Yeah, in the southwestern part of Missouri, in the early 1800s, 5 of my great uncles fought in a battle. A small hunting party met up with a big party of Osage warriors, and they were outnumbered, and they stayed behind and fought to the death to allow the rest of the tribe to escape. But the Osage were very honored by that, and they honored those people for doing that. And most tribes are like that. Anytime they fought a battle against a very formidable enemy, then they would honor him, for fighting. Even though he may have died, he was still a formidable person and a person to be respected. And that's a tradition that still goes on today, actually. Although we don't kill each other today, we use lawyers today, unfortunately. But after that point...
No, excuse me, I was going to say, you mentioned also the Sioux weren't really interested in having the Delaware around at all. There were ever any treaty talks.
Well, yes, whenever I was just speaking with Charlotte Blackout from the Sioux tribe, and I think she's Oglala, and if I'm wrong, I'm sure she's going to be upset. But anyway, it was. I pointed out to her, I said that when the Delawares were here in Oklahoma out of Fort Supply, General Custer's scouts were Delawares. They incidentally, the Delaware scouts thought that Custer was very strange and made comments about that.
Any in particular?
No, that he would not allow himself to be bested, and if the Delawares could outshoot him and outdo something, well, then he had to go out and prove himself. And in that, he was just showing how reckless he really was. But he was a very competitive man, and he was a very vain individual. And the Delawares just thought he was pretty reckless, and so they weren't surprised, when he died in his last battle, his last stand. But the dealings with the Sioux had to deal with the fact that the Delawares were much better shots, and we were talking to this earlier about they were much better armed, and they were able to hold the Sioux at a great distance, and so the Sioux just didn't appreciate that. They were like most tribes, Western tribes. They liked to count coup and come in close to their enemy, but they never could get close to Delawares. I'm sure that was very irritating to them. So whenever they did call for treaty meetings, the Sioux often requested that they not bring the Delaware scouts, and so we found that as a sign of respect, actually. We're kind of honored by that, actually. But we did fight many times with those tribes. In fact, I'm just thinking of another tribe in one of the big treaty meetings in the 1860s, I believe, in Great Bend, Kansas. A couple of years before that, the Delawares had been fighting with the Pawnees over hunting rights, in the western part of Kansas here again, and had actually had some skirmishes, and so there was a little bit of bad blood, and some of the Pawnees had killed a few of the Delawares, and so the chief at that time wanted to exact some revenge on them, so they went out hunting for the Pawnee, but the Pawnees were out on their hunting parties, but they had left their camp open, and very few people there, and so the Delawares burned their camp. And the Pawnees never really knew who had done that until that meeting at Great Bend a couple of years later. And when they did find out, the Delawares came in and said, were asked by the people there at the meeting, the officials, government officials, well, are you still at odds with the Pawnee? And the Delaware chief said, no, we're satisfied because several summers ago we burned their camp down. And that was the first time that the Pawnee actually knew, who had burnt their camp down. And coincidentally, at that point, the Pawnees were sitting right next to the Delawares, and of course there was a skirmish involved there, but that quickly died down. But the Delawares were admired for their bluster for getting up and just admitting it right in front of them. But I think most tribes are that way. Most tribes are very proud people, and those things are something they're really proud of. So. But after we moved into Kansas in the mid-60s, 1860s, the Delawares would move down into Cherokee country and purchase that land down here. And then at that point, they settled down. There were probably only about less than 800 Delawares that actually moved down here. And at some point there finally probably came to be around 950 here. But today the tribe number is about 10,500, and we're doing quite well. Things are moving along for us.
What would you say would be a couple of the major events of the 20th century? Here we are at the end of the 1900s for the Delaware. What have been a couple of big events that have really shaped the future course of events?
Okay, there have been several events that have caused great consternation. Probably the first event, first part of the century, was the dissolution of Cherokee Nation. Then the Dawes Commission, which came along and signed those people up for each tribe. Unfortunately, a lot of people who did not sign, who were eligible members, were virtually left out, of the tribe, and had no recourse, to join the tribe if they weren't, had not signed up. And some of them did come in and sign up, but they signed up on the wrong list. So some might be considered Cherokee, but they're really Delaware, but there's no way to interchange them now unless they actually signed as a Delaware or as a Cherokee. And so that was a major problem for those people. Because a lot of them also would not sign up as full-bloods because there was, at that point at the turn of the century, people were still very prejudiced against Indian people, and so a lot of them, to dissuade that a little bit, would say, they might have been full-blood, they might have been half-blood, and so that was a major problem. Go ahead and shoot through, Tom. We're just talking anyway.
I didn't mean to.
He can edit.
But I won't. I'll just let it keep going.
But,
okay, so that enrollment process was hassle.
That was a problem for a lot of people, and still is today. Then in 1924, it was very difficult for the Indian people to sell off their land, and a lot of them did not want to sell off their land, but they were in such poor condition that it was very difficult for them to make a living. But one of the problems was, in order for those people to buy land, they had to have permission to do that. So probably the only reason that up until that point, Delawares, actually all Indian people, were considered wards of the government. We were not even citizens of the United States until 1924. Even though we'd fought in major wars, World War I, in fact, fought for the country, we weren't even citizens of the country. But at that point, we came off that status, and probably the biggest reason for that was so that the land prospectors, could come in, carpetbaggers, like in the 1860s in the South, could come in and buy land cheap from those people and have free purchase to that land, and cheated a lot of people out of a lot of money, but they felt like they had no choice. So a lot of them lost their allotments and selling them very, very cheaply, $2 an acre, and the money just did not last, and that was real unfortunate that happened. But some people are kind of surprised that, and even I'm surprised that people don't know that Native American people were not even members of the United States until 1924. So that's kind of an interesting outlook. The next problem that comes along is we have an argument with the Cherokee Nation. In 1979, we were actually taken off the federal roll and have fought with the United States government and Cherokee Nation for the last 18 years. But that decision was reversed, and we finally have regained our status as a tribe, federal recognition. Although that still goes on today, we're still actually fighting in court over some parts of it. So far, we've won in every sense of the way, and you don't tell people what their heritage is. You can't legislate, your own ethics or your own history or your own ethos even, and that's exactly what's had to happen. But unfortunately, in the Native American world, because of our status as sovereign nations, we're the only people in the United States that have to prove who we are. And so doing, that makes it real difficult for a lot of people to understand, the problems that we have to face and why we are so proud of trying to tell everybody who we are. And so that's where that problem comes from. But we have pretty much, solved that problem. And I know the people themselves, most of that has to do with money rather than, your tribal history, or your blood. Most of it has to do with money. And unfortunately, a lot of tribes think that way. And wish they shouldn't. But that's kind of the way things have gone, in these days. And we have to fight against it ourselves every day. But all of the rights that we have, the federally mandated things that are given to Native American people, such as free health care, those things are mandated. We're always going to have that. But control of those funds to offer that is what most tribes fight over. And it's an unfortunate side effect of that. But most tribes get along real well. In fact, most tribes are doing real well. In fact, that some tribes are not even taking federal monies anymore. They're providing, they've done enough economic development with their own people that they can provide their own services. They don't even need federal funds anymore. The casinos, things that are so highlighted today, there are over 500 tribes in this country. 37 tribes have casinos. The other 450 don't, but everybody thinks, most tribes are rich. They're not. Delaware's are certainly in that, and we have a trust fund that we operate our things under. We do have access to federal funds now. We can provide better services, and we will be doing our own economic development. And so those things will come, and we'll carry on. The history of tribe will carry on, hopefully. And people my age have to take our kids by the hand. I used to say, when I was young, most things that you learned from your tribal people, you had to ask. That was the thing. You had to be willing to do that. So you had to go to an elder and say, would you help me, learn these songs? Would you help me, learn the stomp dance? Would you help me learn the language? If you didn't have that opportunity. And for a long time, people didn't ask. So a lot of things were lost. But today, when I do things, I just tell these young kids, you're not going to ask me to do this. You are going to do this. You are going to learn this because you have to pass it on. You have to make sure that our tradition goes on. So they don't have that opportunity anymore. And I wish more tribes were that way. That they should just tell them, you have to learn this. You have to do this. If we don't lose it, we're a heartbeat away from losing a lot of things. A lot of tribes are a heartbeat away from losing everything because it's just not being passed on the way it should. And I hope ours is not one of those. But there are probably 200 languages, over 200 languages in the country. 80 of them are probably going to survive, and maybe 25 or 30 of them are actually going to be spoken languages, in the next 30 years. And so that's a tremendous loss. But it's just the way things have gone. There's too many other things. There's no tribal unity anymore. People are too mobile. There's too many other things to do. But some tribes are making a comeback from that and making it more interesting for their kids. They're able to have more control over their education, which is a very good thing. They get to learn more about who they are, and that way they will retain a lot more. And I hope that's something that we will do too. So.
What do you think are some of the challenges for Indian youth today as opposed to when you were growing up? Teenager today, college student today.
Well, teenager today, if they don't have anything that they have learned at an early age, probably they're not going to learn too much. They're not going to pick up too much. But there are quite a few, especially in Oklahoma. We have the greatest population here. There are a lot of young people that are very interested in their history. Although some of that has become more of a powwow oriented, which is really a pan-Indian and intertribal type thing. That is a way of getting them together. And though they may be a complete mix of different things, I believe it will be very important to them. And there seems to be a greater pride in being Native American now than there used to be back in when I was young. Of course, I was in a closed society here. Most of the people that lived here were Indian, so I never had that feeling like, I was always proud of who I was, and I was always proud to tell anybody who I was. But in some areas, you just didn't do that because there was a lot of hate, a lot of mistrust, a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding about Native American people. So there was a great lack of pride, but that pride is coming back now, and it seems to be taking a better hold of the younger people. And so if they have any kind of connection, it would be good for them to retain that and to move on that. And there are a lot of opportunities. We're training, sending kids to school, and we're getting them back. And they're wanting to come back and help the tribe, and that's really something we haven't seen for a long time. And if they have that kind of opportunity, most tribes can offer them that opportunity, then that's better for the tribe. So, and there are plenty of jobs for those kind of people who have done that. Within the tribe, we probably have 5 or 6 people that we've sent to school now that are now back working for the tribe, and bringing that back. And there are a lot of other opportunities, and the more we grow, the more economic development we do. We're going to be looking for those kids, and it's not going to be just specifically, about, tribal history or tribal politics or lawyers or federal monies, federal programs. We're also talking business and, computers and, electronic engineers and things, those people are going to be wanting to come back in the tribe. And I think that's a great opportunity, if we can do that. And tribes are beginning to do that, and it's really tremendous. One interesting story I always like to tell about that particular type thing is that when the Navajos in the 60s and 70s were having to sell their minerals, the government appointed lawyers to have them set up, the payments to the tribes. Unbeknownst to those people, the people that were lawyers were also working for the companies that were selling, and buying this property. So they were making all the money, and the tribe was getting very little. They might be getting $40 or $50 million in mineral rights and payments for the purchase of those minerals, but the tribe might only get 10% of that money. The rest of it went to the lawyers and whoever thing was going on. The Navajos one year, when that lease was up, and those people came, the Navajo had their own people there, and they said, "What's this?" "These are our new lawyers." "Where'd they come from?" "They're Navajos. We sent them to school. They're the ones who are going to negotiate for us." And so that era is over, and so it was a big turnaround, and the tribe got a lot more, and they got what they deserved. But it was because they had people that were willing to come back and work for the tribe and make sure that things were done right. And so that's what they did. And so that's the way I kind of see most tribes. I think they're starting to come back like that. And, some tribes have greater opportunities. You know, the Navajos, the Cherokees, huge tribes. You know, they have a lot more opportunities. And there's a lot of smaller tribes. Some may only have 5 or 6 people in it. But all of them completely uniquely different. All of them have their own special problems, their own special history, their own special place in history even. And they're all unique. You know, but it's wonderful to just sit down, and there's so much to learn about each one of them. One of the big things about Oklahoma, of course, is that we have 39 tribes here, although we're a lot more representative, you know, here. But we're all here together. We all learn from each other, and there's so much more to learn from everybody. There's a lot of intertribal play here, a lot of intertribal dances, and so we know quite a bit about many different tribes, you know. And it's unique for the fact that we have a lot of things in common, and it's unique for the fact that we don't have a lot of things in common. You know, we all have different ways of looking. We all have different, you know, things that we do that are special to us, or ceremonials, or even social things that we do. Those things are all, you know, really interesting, and we have great opportunity here. It's just like teaching, you know, a language class. I've taught our people to speak to 100. You know, well, there are not that many that do that. We have very few fluent speakers, maybe 1 or 2. But I always try to impress upon them that it's, you know, how many people in this world can even speak that language? You're sitting right here. You know, that's how unique it is. And so possessing that, making sure that it gets passed on. I'm sure someday, you know, I always recall some of the words and many different things, you know, that we even say. That every day there's fewer and fewer Delawares. You hear that a lot. Many tribes say the same thing. There's fewer and fewer. And someday the Creator, there won't be any more. You know, so that's the legacy that we're left with. You know, so it's up to us to try to preserve, you know, what we can. And there may not be any of us left, but the legacy, you know, that we left will still be there. And whether that means anything, I don't know. It means a lot to me, but you know, at some point it may not mean very much. But at least we're living that way.
Excuse me, could you give us a final, say, send-off or goodbye in Delaware?
Well, sure. When the Delawares speak to each other, they never have a word for goodbye.
Many tribes.
And many tribes, yeah, they don't say it that way. We always will just say, I will see you again. And to say that, we would say, Lapich Kanewo.
Lapich Kanewo.
Lapich Kanewo. Or you can say Hulapi Kanewo. There's many different ways of saying that. But that's the most common use of, you know, I'll see you again.
Na na